The Conservative Party brand has been catastrophically tarnished. People stop listening to the Tory party. I've just had enough of them. I wouldn't consider voting for them. What a shower, what a rabble, what a shambles, all of the rest of it. I think that the centre-right needs to start being anti-establishment. And this is going to be quite a pivot for the Conservative Party. In my broad view, if you look at the rest of the Western world, that the right is remaking itself in that image. Although you can't look at problems and demographics in one country and just hit Control-C, Control-V and cut and paste it onto the UK, it seems to me that there are so many examples of this that the new message and approach of the centre-right needs to be one which is the present system is broken and needs to be completely overhauled.
So I thought Southampton were a little bit unlucky on the weekend against Liverpool.
Yeah, we're a bit. We're making a habit of being unlucky.
Yeah. Anyway, look, great to meet Mark. Joe said I have to talk to you.
Blimey.
Insisted that I have to talk to you. Can you tell me a little bit about PopCon? Because I think that will be a good starting point.
Yes. So PopCon, or to give it its proper name, Popular Conservatism, is a new group that I and some others set up in February of 2024. Has to be said in anticipation that the Conservatives were likely to lose office in a general election, which came a little earlier than we thought. And we posed ourselves a question in private, and having found what we thought the correct answer was, we wanted to share that publicly and evangelise it. And the question was, after 14 years of Conservative government, why was the United Kingdom in virtually no aspect more conservative than when the Conservative Party found it and came to office in 2010? That was the puzzle and that was the question. And of course, the easy go-to answers were there was a lack of political will, the Liberal Democrats held us back for 5 years, Brexit was a distraction, COVID was a distraction, Boris doesn't focus on detail, Truss was mad, Sunak was boring, whatever. Theresa May was even more boring. But we thought those were rather superficial answers, and actually there was a deeper, bigger answer. And that was that we had allowed to grow up prior to taking office, basically from Tony Blair onwards, a new bureaucratic and institutional infrastructure in the UK that, whilst it doesn't make pursuing Conservative ends impossible, it makes it bloody difficult. So we have allowed to grow wherever you may look. I mean, if you were to take the Human Rights Act, for example, has made, I think, a sensible immigration and asylum policy extremely difficult. The love of the experts. So rather than the Chancellor and politicians deciding fiscal policy, this is all franchised out to the Office for Budget Responsibility, whose predictions are pretty woeful. If they give you a tip in the 320 at Chepstow, don't take it, back any other horse. The Bank of England, who I think you can make a case for being independent, but appear to be wholly out of control and unaccountable. The Equality Act, again, sounds nice with what it says on the tin, but we've now got into the bizarre case in which courts are setting wages for employees of clothes stores like Next. The Climate Change Committee, almost certainly more powerful than the Environment Secretary. So wherever you basically looked for any major decision, power was no longer vested in Parliament. It was vested in these sort of independent arm's length quangos that you could overcome. But it was our conclusion that to overcome them was a bit like an exercise in pushing water uphill. You could get a few drips pushed uphill, but you were basically going to lose. Or to use a football analogy, which I'm very fond of doing, you're playing on a pitch, but with only 8 men kicking uphill both halves. The referee and the linesman and the person manning the VR booth are all bent against you. Well, you might score the odd goal. You might even win the odd match if you're incredibly lucky, but you're not going to win over the course of a season. So our conclusion was if Conservatives are serious about the next period of government, you need to unpick all of that infrastructure. And if you like, we've been looking at the valley and saying, well, blimey, it's a bit dry and arid here. The water's not flowing downhill. Things are pretty terrible in the valley. What can we do? Can we sprinkle a bit of water on it or relay the grass? But actually the problem is upstream. There are huge blockages. This out-of-touch quangocracy that we see in all sorts of different facets of our lives. And unless you tackle that upstream point, and unblock the dam, then the valley is always going to be dry and arid. So that was our sort of proposition that we thought the Conservative Party needed to understand in the wake of a defeat. We weren't trying to bring about a Conservative defeat, but we thought it was easily the most likely outcome, and of course that came to pass. So we're trying to spread that message and that analysis principally within the Conservative Party and the Conservative movement itself. I mean, I'd love to persuade all 60 million members of the general public of that proposition, but the starting point is does the Conservative movement get that proposition? And then attached to it, we've got two slightly subsidiary aims, you might say, that were you to buy that basic hypothesis that we need full-scale institutional change which re-empowers Parliament and allows the Chancellor to write the budget, not the head of the OBR, however wise or unwise the Chancellor might be. The Conservative Party itself should apply the same logic to its own structures. And the Conservative Party itself, I mean, this is a boring, nerdy point that won't particularly interest voting members of the public. When I was canvassing at the last election, absolutely nobody on any doorstep said to me, well, I might vote for you, but I'm a bit concerned about your subcommittee on how you select and vet candidates, said no one. But the party should practice what it preaches, and that means the Conservative Party should be democratised rather than the ghastly sight of the chairman of the party finding about the only safe seat left than putting himself on a short list of one to be the candidate. So the party needs to be completely reformed. And then the other subsidiary point is likely at some point, although we're not adamant about what form this should take, there needs to be some sort of rapprochement on the centre-right of politics between the Conservatives and Reform. Maybe it's a merger, maybe it's an electoral pact, maybe it's a pact of non-aggression in certain seats. Perhaps the Conservative Party can steal Reform's globes and Reformers will think, oh, actually, it's fine to, the Conservative Party are running on our platform now, we'll rejoin them. But somehow or other, those parties need to come together. And today, I actually saw an opinion poll earlier, again, just a snapshot. Who knows which way public opinion will go over the course of this Parliament, showing the Conservatives on 29%, Labour on 25%, and Reform on 22%. Well, if 29-22 remains the broad split between those two parties, surely it would be utter madness to go into an election and fight 650 seats against each other. We'll see. That could all change. That could all alter. So that's our proposition. And we're seeking to recruit Conservatives, generally Conservative Party members, but not explicitly. We've got a good number of people who actually support the Reform Party on our books.
100,000 they just announced today,
they've got 100,000 members. We surveyed a subset of our database. 68% in this ghastly term self-identified as Conservatives, and 24% self-identified as Reform. So that's what we're about. We are proselytising, but we're not really a think tank. We will release a book early next year, short book on this proposition. So it's not just me gassing off to people like you on podcasts. There will actually be a text that people can read to better explain it. And we want to persuade the Conservative Party of it. And I'm modestly optimistic in that kind of educational battle, in that I think Kemi Badenoch basically gets it. She speaks along these terms, at least on that key proposition. I'm a bit less optimistic about the party reforming itself and about Reform and the Conservatives potentially at some point having to find an arrangement.
Okay, a lot there. So for context, I've probably had in my adult voting life probably about 7 elections. Mm-hmm. I've voted in 4 of them. I've only ever voted Conservative, but I haven't actually voted in the last 3 elections.
Right. Why is that?
Because I hold strong Conservative values, and I don't see a huge difference between the current Conservative Party and Blair's Labour Party. And just, I've also become a quite libertarian, not anarcho-capitalist, but believing in much smaller government. And so I've just become almost politically homeless. And so one of the first questions I was going to ask you, because I thought this was an important one, is what's important here? Is it Conservative Party or Conservative values? Because reform are definitely speaking to me in the language I like. I just don't know if they are being a little naive with their budgets and budgetary planning. But anyway, so that's kind of where I am. Interesting enough, though, actually, this week someone dropped me an email. They sent me a Thatcher manifesto. I think it was 1971, but it might be 1979. You'll know better.
1979.
1979, that'll be the one, yeah. Where she was talking about the role of the state, the size of the state, empowering business. Yeah, and I've been just going down rabbit holes of some of her speeches in terms of, like, when she was saying the government doesn't have any money. There's no public money. It's only your money. Yeah. And I started to think, hold on, what? This is the language I think a lot of people want to hear right now.
Yeah.
That we're not.
I think that's right. So to be clear about, I am a member of the Conservative Party, but to my mind, the Conservative Party is a vehicle. I'm not a kind of, however well or badly they do, of course, across the rest of my life, I will always be a supporter of Southampton Football Club. The same does not necessarily apply with the same, vigour to the Conservative Party. So if somebody could prove to me that a different vehicle was the best way of promoting conservative values and forming a conservative government, I'm open-minded to that suggestion. I'm not blind or blinkered. I don't really care what shade of blue is on the rosette. But it's my practical judgment that the Conservative Party is the best vehicle for bringing this about, for all of its failings, for all of its wetness, for all of its wrong-headed embrace of the Blairite consensus. Despite the fact that tax and spending have gone up over the last 14 years, as has regulation, wokery has grown. There's been, even when they've talked the Conservative talk, they've not walked the walk. Despite all of that, it's my cool-headed, calm judgment, not out of any sort of brand loyalty, that the most likely vehicle to form the sort of government and administration that it sounds like you and I would want is the Conservative and Unionist Party. In what was its worst result since democracy began on July the 4th, still came a very clear second in votes and beat the Reform Party, by 10% of the popular vote and by more than 20-1 on seats. That's not grounds for complacency. That could change. But my guess would be that probably was the darkest hour for the Conservative Party. It probably won't be put out of business by Nigel Farage. I don't rule it out that it could happen, but I think it unlikely. So the better thing to do is to try and transform the Conservatives into a vehicle that can actually promote serious change and reform, who I've got great respect for, people who sincerely take the view that a completely new vehicle is needed. I think, unfortunately, by them being in Reform rather than being in the Conservative Party makes my task harder. Now, we'll see who ends up being right. If in 3 years' time the Tories are at 7% of the vote in the polls and Farage is at 34% of the vote and swathes of sound-thinking Conservatives have joined Reform, well, I'll have to reappraise my strategy. But I don't anticipate that will occur. Yeah.
It's been really interesting talking to just friends, just having a drink, down the gym, whatever, talking to people. The thing that I found is quite interesting that Reform have done is they've actually taken people from Conservative and Labour.
Yeah.
I know Labour voters who voted in this last election are like, shit, I thought we were going to get something better than the Conservatives and we got something worse. And now I don't trust either of the main two parties. All that I've got left is Farage. All I've got left is Reform. And I think some of them are quite coy in admitting it, but that has happened.
Yeah.
And I think I've been following Kemi since she's come in, and I watched PMQs the other day, and I'll be honest, I just thought it's a bit boring, same stuff, some biscuit jokes.
Yeah. Well, don't hang your entire hat on one outing at PMQs, right?
But I don't think she's had much cut through yet.
Yeah, I think that's fair as well. But, she has been party leader for all of 3.5 weeks or whatever it is. And I think there are signs that let's look firstly at her sort of presentational skills, which I think are basically pretty strong. She does not talk like a boring politician. I think her recent statement on immigration, put aside whether you agree or disagree with it, was pretty crystal clear that we've got this wrong. There needs to be a complete reset. I thought during the Conservative leadership campaign, although I supported Robert Jenrick, you could not accuse Kemi of not saying what she thought. And, she doesn't tend to dissemble or, it was always said about Theresa May that the answer that Theresa May would give to any binary question was always 0.5. And I don't think you can say that of Kemi. She'll either give you a 0 or a 1, whether you agree with it or not. And the attraction of, there's a couple of things going on here. Firstly, the Conservative Party brand has been catastrophically tarnished, right? So it's not wholly just a question of what policies you put forward. People stop listening to the Tory party. I've just had enough of them. I wouldn't consider voting for them. What a shower, what a rabble, what a shambles, all of the rest of it. And that somehow has to be recovered under new leadership, which probably involves quite a lot of mea culpa by Kemi, which she started with on immigration. The second thing, and I don't know how much one can derive from the rest of the world about the likely trajectory of British politics, but I think that the centre-right needs to start being anti-establishment.
Yes.
And this is going to be quite a pivot for the Conservative Party, whose natural default setting is whatever framework, policies and structures we find are likely the wisdom of ages, and tamper with them at your peril. So not that you can never change anything, but that we should, the default setting is to be sceptical about that. That has to change. And in my broad view, if you look at the rest of the Western world, that the right is remaking itself in that image. The mainstream right, I'm not talking about the rise of far-right groups. I'm talking about the Canadian Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, who's likely to come to office on a very staunchly anti-establishment ticket and style. Clearly Donald Trump and the Republicans. Is Farage the Anglo equivalent of Trump and what's basically now a new Republican Party? Probably. Meloni in Italy. I don't count Le Pen. I consider her to be a leftist rather than a right-of-centre politician.
Millet?
Millet, for sure. I'm absolutely fantastic.
He was at Mar-a-Lago this week, wasn't he?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Fantastic. Full-blooded libertarian. So although you can't look at problems and demographics in one country and just hit Control-C, Control-V and cut and paste it onto the UK, it seems to me that there are so many examples of this that the new message and approach of the centre-right needs to be one which is the present system is broken and needs to be completely overhauled. Farage does communicate that pretty clearly and unambiguously. And I think the Conservatives need to start singing in the same sort of tone of voice. Sunak, I quite like as a person, and I think is an honourable man, was the absolute antithesis of that. That the whole approach was, we're the safe pair of hands, steady as you go, we're going to run this like a Goldman Sachs spreadsheet, trust me. That won't do. That the anger out there and the discontentment and the ennui is so big that I think I'm unsurprised at what you say about Labour voters who are just perhaps shrugging their shoulders. I'm sick of the whole lot. And Reform have tapped into that in a way that Tories haven't.
I'll tell you why I think it happens. I think why it happens is I don't think a lot of, it might sound like I'm degrading people here, but I don't think a lot of voters really truly understand economics. I don't think they truly understand the impact of high debt or a high deficit. And they get sick of one party, they see another party, and they don't really fully understand like the socialist background to Labour Party and what that actually really means. So I think it's just like, I've got to vote for somebody, I'll vote for them. And a lot of people didn't vote. But I think what they've realised is like this, it's almost like this uni-party establishment thing. It's like, actually, it doesn't matter who I fucking vote for. It's just the same. I'm just going to say the same shit. Whereas we've really experienced it in our wage packets, in our wallets over the last 4 or 5 years. I think people are starting to realise, hold on, I want something drastically different. And you look across to the US, and we'll see what Trump's able to do. But certainly the language of Trump and the appointments he's had, and Elon and Vivek and RFK and Tulsi, it's all very anti-establishment. Let's strip back government, let's get rid of all this bullshit. And I think that's what a lot of people want, which is why I think a lot of Thatcher stuff's coming up on social media, because essentially that's how she spoke. And I think people want that.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
I agree with you. Look, if Kemi Badenoch pivots towards a more kind of centrist position, I don't mean ideologically, as only ideologically, in terms of style as well, that we actually think growth will be 0.3% higher under a Conservative government, says this think tank, rather than channel this anger. And I think you're right, an appetite for, you might say, an appetite for risk. That certainly seems to be what's happened in America. I don't think many people voted for Donald Trump thinking, well, he's the safest pair of hands. They voted for Donald Trump because he's going to tear up some trees, right? He's going to reboot the system. It's the best way of socking it to the system. And I think the Conservatives do risk being brushed aside if they're not unambiguous in the way they deliver that message, because reform will deliver that message. So to give an acid test of that, the question of whether Britain should stay in the ECHR or not strikes me as not of itself the most important question facing the nation. Let's not believe if we left the ECHR that the immigration problem's sorted out overnight. Of course it wouldn't be. You need to unravel a whole load of domestic stuff as well. But it seems to me that's the sort of thing where, if you're serious about radical change in Britain in general and you're worried about immigration, you should be able to send a pretty clear signal that you mean it by saying, well, obviously we're going to leave the ECHR. And I suppose I'm just a little concerned that Kemi, who I think will get there, is, well, we need to put this out to review and consider it over the next year or two. Yeah, okay, fine. I mean, obviously the Conservative Party doesn't need a programme for government yet, but you would have thought that's the sort of thing where you could say, well, it's obvious we're going to leave the ECHR. Why on earth wouldn't we? And repeal the Human Rights Act. And if the Conservative Party finds coming out with those sort of out-of-the-box, potentially unconventional ideas, certainly would have been considered very unconventional 5 years ago, then we're in trouble. But I think there is a pathway to get to being, well, these are the list of all the quangos and the bodies that we're going to abolish. And of course, the wider electorate, don't all have PhDs in economics, but they're a pretty wise bunch in aggregate, the British electorate. I mean, if you look back over elections over my lifetime, I can't point to a single election in which I thought, what on earth were the British electorate doing there? They must have gone collectively mental. There appears to be a rational, the result of each election has some rationality behind it. And I think broadly people are beginning to get that, the state doesn't work. Big government doesn't work. And it certainly doesn't work for them. And for all of the public spending, colossal public spending we've had, is the NHS now the envy of the world? I mean, how's our public transport system doing? Good, bad, indifferent, terrible, I'd say. So I think there is a sense there that, and crucially, that the political elite are out of touch, that the preoccupations of the general preoccupations of those at a senior level in politics are not the overriding preoccupations of the average voter, and sort of obsession with diversity, equality and inclusion and climate change and your carbon footprint. No, I'm not completely suggesting that there's no environmental issue that we face and there's no issue about discrimination, but these seem to be the overarching preoccupations of the political establishment. And the overarching preoccupations of the average voter is, why is my kid being taught woke nonsense in school? Why isn't my salary going up? Why am I being taxed to death? And why am I having to comply with more and more regulations? Well, that should be an open goal for a centre-right political movement. It is an open goal, as long as the Conservatives have got the cojones to actually kick the ball in the back of the net.
Yeah, but that's the big question. Have they? I mean, I'm a business owner. I like risk. I like to go against the grain. I like disruption. I'm a big fan of what Bukele's done in El Salvador. I know it's like slightly unconstitutional for a second term, but it's a big job, and he's turned the country around. It's gone from the murder capital of the world to, I think it's the safest place the lowest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere. And I've been out to Argentina, pre-Malay. I've got friends there, and people are speaking very positive. And now, it's like a tiny country, and then an old historic big country. But now we've got the United States of America essentially kind of on a centre-right / libertarian approach. And I'm just sat here as a business owner, a taxpayer, a parent, thinking, fuck, I've got 4 or 5 more years of this shit before we might have some of this action. And so I'm screaming out for it. This is why when I'm on Twitter at the moment, it's Rupert Lowe, it's Richard Tice, it's Farage. I'm like, this is interesting. And I'm just, why aren't the Conservatives being more radical? Why aren't the Conservatives being, why aren't they taking this opportunity at a time when Labour is so bad and they're fucking everything up? Why aren't they in there just being loud and bold and saying, like, they've seen the American public have bought this. Why aren't they doing this? Just out there doing the same. What's the challenge to them?
Well, I mean, I basically agree with you, and I don't want to just sound like a hopeful procrastinator by saying give it time. But
that's fair. Though.
But Badenoch's being the party leader for, I think as we're speaking today, 26 days, right? So the Tories had a lengthy period of introspection. Unbelievably protracted leadership contest, unusually long. Although I thought that was actually quite healthy to reflect upon, where the party was. By accident, possibly rather than by design, but nevertheless, the two who made it to the final round, I thought were the two most radical of the 6, probably. Patel fell at the first hurdle. I don't know what wider policy proposition she would have made if she'd made it a bit further. But the two most radical out of the box, we've got to change the way things are done, were Badenoch and Jenrick, and they made the last 2. It slightly shot Popcorn's Fox, by the way. We were sort of assuming that the basic standard law of Conservative internal politics would apply, that the system was designed to always throw up a dry against a wet, and it would then fall on us to back the dry. Actually, Kemi versus Robert, it was quite difficult to know how to split the difference between them. As I say, we finally came down for Robert, but not an easy choice. So, look, if she is not making waves, within the next year, we've got a problem. The Conservative Party's got a problem, and reform will continue to rise. But my audit of her first 3 weeks is broadly positive. I don't think that you can derive an enormous amount from it, however positive or bland you might think it's been. The test is over the next 12 months. And if in 12 months' time it's all sort of mealy-mouthed, tack to the centre, don't frighten the horses, then she and the Conservative Party are going to have a colossal problem on their hands. So that's about my time frame to give a proper audit of a new leader. Yes, I agree with you. It is going to be grim the next 4 years. Barring some sort of unbelievable cataclysm, it's difficult to see how Labour won't be in office for the full period, right? I mean, they're not going to call an election if they're tanking in the opinion polls, and they've got a majority of 100 million or whatever it is, so they're not going to lose a motion of no confidence. So we probably have got another 4 years of this absolute crap. And I'm afraid, we're just going to have to suck it up. I mean, if you wanted to be mildly optimistic about it, you might say that it's a bit like the vaccine rollout, that we're going to inject ourselves with a couple of doses of socialism in order to hopefully inoculate ourselves against it. That's the only silver lining I can see. But yeah, it's going to be a grim 3 or 4 years. But I used to work for the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I always had ringing in my ears the words written rather than spoken, by the first ever Director General of the IEA, a free market think tank, when in the mid-1970s he was being told by his friends, what's the point of what you're doing? I mean, it's all very well you producing these pamphlets arguing for privatisations and deregulation, but you've got your head in the clouds. I mean, the country's basically run by the unions. Everything's nationalised, not just major industries, half of the bloody tourism sector, the computer industry, God knows what else. Get with it. Things are going to go in that direction. And his response was, cheer up, things can only get worse. And what he meant by that was that there would be an inflection point. And sure enough, there was. Now, that's not to say that the Labour government of the late 1970s, 74 to 79, didn't do a lot of damage to the country. It did. And I don't wish any kind of damage on the United Kingdom. But in practical political terms, it might be that, we're basically now going to test to destruction the idea that higher spending, higher regulation, more taxes and more government is the route to prosperity and joy. I mean, because that's essentially the Labour Party's proposition.
Sure. How many times do we have to do this, though?
Well, I mean, I suppose the difference is that the Conservatives essentially carried out a slightly similar, slightly less toxic, but nevertheless similar program, but pretended that they weren't.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's now no ambiguity about this. These guys think that the way to get more public sector productivity is to give inefficient public sector workers pay rises with no strings attached. Let's see how that works out. That we will fund this by heavier taxes on the private sector. That if we come across any sort of problem, that the state should do more rather than less to solve it. And they're pretty straightforward that is their view. They wouldn't frame it in quite the way that I have, but they're not really talking in any meaningful way about any markets that they can liberalise or regulations that they can get rid of or quangos that they can close down or major savings they can make.
It's more. It's more instead.
It's more of the whole lot. And with the government saying we're going to do more of the whole lot. This is their plan for growth. Right?
Sure.
Now, the Conservatives did put up tax and spending and regulation, but they never made that the banner that they were asking people to flock to. They sort of said, it's quite difficult at this time. They were just sort of seeding ground, tedious inch by tedious inch. No, the Labour Party actually firmly believe this is the way to go. And, it was Ronald Reagan who said, wasn't it, what are the rules of government? If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidise it. And that's what Labour are going to do. So that's going to be horrifically bad for the United Kingdom. But my hope would be that this will mean that the battle lines are rather clearer at the next general election. You were just sort of saying, haven't voted for a while, uni party, they all seem much the same. Well, I don't think that will be the case in 2029. I think the electorate will be asked to choose a clear path. And, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe all of this huge government spending will work in some bizarre Keynesian way that I can't work out, but the choice will be there. And that makes it crystal clear. And I think there will be a choice between a radical centre-right proposition and another dead cat bounce of social democracy.
Yeah.
And that's quite exciting. The problem is we've got 4 years of the dead cat bouncing, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's pretty rough. And, just as a business owner, I say taxpayer, I don't really take much out of the public sector. And I'm not greedy. I don't mind paying some tax. I don't mind contributors. I accept the social contract. But just as a business operator alone, multiple businesses, at the moment I'm just this is such hard work and it's getting harder. The changes to the employment laws is just so unnecessary. And what my gut feel is I will be voting the next election. And it will be either a reformed Conservative Party or the Reform Party. Yeah. And I don't really care which one it is, but I just want to get back to a bit more common sense. But I guess one of the things I want to ask you is, how do you actually educate, how do you communicate to Labour voters that the policies and the things that Labour say to you are actually counterproductive to what you want to achieve? For what you think is the outcome, they actually are counterproductive. Yeah,
it's a good question. But I'm going to be honest with you, it's not one that I've greatly addressed myself to because although, I would like 100% of the electorate to agree with my kind of pseudo-libertarian conservative position, I don't need 100% of the electorate to agree with it. I need 40% of the electorate to agree with it. So, although as an interesting thought experiment, if I met a lifelong Labour voter and they sort of say, you've got 30 minutes to try and persuade them, I'd give it a go. And I think it's an empirical proposition, isn't it, that it isn't working, it doesn't work. This is not delivering. I think we've got to be a lot clearer on the centre right about how we should be praising millionaires, not vilifying them. That these are the people who are contributing all of the tax, and we're now obliging them, or at least incentivising them to leave the country. The Conservatives are partly to blame for this, but there seems to be a belief in public debate that we've been through some sort of period of austerity in the government sector. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. Austerity is when you are spending less than you earn. I mean, we haven't balanced a budget since 2001. So I think my message would be, but not that I'm necessarily the person to communicate it. I think the message might become clear just because of unfolding events, that one more heave on more tax and more spending is not going to work. We're going to have to go down a completely different path if you want prosperity to return. And as I say, it's more on although I worked for an economic think tank for 14 years, I reflected, spent some time after I left reflecting on it. It is, I think, that you've got to tackle all of this upstream stuff. You've got to dissemble the large parts of the apparatus of the state. And there, I think there is a bigger appetite right across the political spectrum. That Labour voters, I don't think, are in love with the quangocracy. They don't trust Westminster either. And therefore, I think the message is we're going to completely rewire this. Your life is not going to be run by endless committees and quangos and arm's length bodies that you've never goddamn heard of. It's going to be run by whichever politicians you select. And if you don't like what those politicians are doing and saying, then you kick them out. But the buck is going to stop with them. Anecdote alert, but I was on GB News a couple of weeks ago, and they had they showed an interview with the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. And I don't know all of the details about the case, but it was a 9-year-old kid in some classroom somewhere had accused another 9-year-old kid, or said that some other 9-year-old kid smelt like fish. Okay,
was this the investigation afterwards?
And this then led to the police attending the classroom. Right?
Is this it?
It might be on here. Yes.
I want you, gentlemen, to listen to this interview with Bridget Phillipson, who is our illustrious Secretary of State for Education, and she was asked a pretty simple question.
Called another kid, said that they smelt like fish. Surely you would accept, on the face of it, that that's preposterous for the police to be involved.
As a point of principle, and I mean this sincerely, I think it's unwise for politicians to get involved in discussions around operational policing matters.
Yeah, but the point is that you're the Education Secretary, so you're in charge of what happens in our classrooms. 2
points. As you say, I am responsible for what happens in our classrooms. I'm not responsible for the police forces in our country.
So what she was asked was enough.
It's so frustrating.
Well, it's madness, isn't it? Because, she really does invite the question, what the bloody hell is the point of Bridget Phillipson? I mean, if the Education Secretary is not going to take a view on those sort of things, what's the point of having an Education Secretary? Let's just leave the entire education. Let's just get rid of the politicians and live in the equivalent of East Germany, in which some unelected Politburo will appoint all of the other unelected subcommittees that run everything.
Why is she scared though? Why is she scared to go? Yeah, this is fucking nonsense.
Well, quite. I mean, I can't. You'd have to ask her.
But that's a common thread with politicians. I do find that I just don't. I don't feel you really get honest. Like Rishi Sunak, right? I found him very frustrating. Frustrating because I felt like he was speaking to me like I was a 10-year-old. It was really patronising. But following the budget, Reeves' budget, I thought that was the best I ever saw him.
Yeah.
He changed and he went and he was honest and he was blunt. And I just don't think we get honesty from these politicians anymore. So
it's interesting, actually. I think quite often politicians of all stripes are a lot better when they've retired. As Kamala Harris would say, they are unburdened by what has been.
We had Steve Baker in there, who was brilliant.
Yeah, and Steve's terrific. But it is an oddity that I've never been a high position in government, but it seems to place a burden and a straitjacket on people with an incredible safety-first attitude, right? And, you clearly want the Prime Minister to be a responsible person who isn't just going out shooting from the hip in order to get a meme, trending on Twitter. But Sunak is now unburdened by that. He's got nothing to lose. He can shoot from the hip. And when politicians have that ability, they speak a lot more clearly. What the hell was going through Bridget Phillipson's head is completely beyond me. I mean, perhaps she didn't know. Let's try and be sympathetic to her for the sake of argument. Perhaps she doesn't really know the details of the case. Perhaps, this 9-year-old said, "You smell like fish," and then he, got out a bloody knife or something. I don't know. Maybe she wasn't aware of the full details of the case. But in which case, surely the answer is, I'm not aware of the full details of the case, but on the face of this is completely bananas and should never happen in a British classroom. And I can tell you, I've already put in a call to the chairman of the board of governors of the school. I've asked to meet the headmaster of the school to work, and I've asked my equivalent number at the Home Office or whatever to speak to the local police force. That's the response you want. And it just struck me that we now have a generation of... I was a bit worried that we had a generation of politicians who were emasculated but didn't know it, who were attempting to get things done, and sort of only when they got to high office did they realise, as Tony Blair once said, that you're not pulling levers, you're pushing string. But now I think we've got a generation of politicians, perfectly exemplified by Bridget Phillipson, who want to be emasculated. She doesn't want to take a position on whether it's appropriate or not that police enter the classroom. That's an operational matter. Absolutely unbelievable.
But I don't think we're getting good people in office now. I know that's a generalisation. I've talked about it on this podcast a few times now. After the budget, I did the research. There's not a single person on the Labour front bench who's ever run a business.
I think it's worse than that. I think none of them have even ever worked in the private sector, isn't it?
I mean, the lawyers maybe worked in the private sector. Fair. But it's lawyers, trade unions, charity workers, and again, no discredit to any of...
Oh, Rachel Reeves ran a complaints unit at HBOS.
Oh, no. It kills me when they call her Rachel for complaints. But at the same time, I'm like, not one of you has ever sat there worrying about payroll. Yep. Not one of you has got a crappy sales forecast. Not one of you's got on the phone to try and drive sales for a business. None of you have understand it. Conservatives are much better. I think there was 2 I saw on the front bench. But also, I can't connect with them. I connected with Steve Baker when he was here, but I generally can't connect with them. Weirdly, I think the person I feel, this is going to sound completely potty, but the one I feel the biggest connection with, strangely, is Angela Rayner. Not because I agree with any of her policies. I think she's wrong on almost everything. But she's a real human, right? I liked her raving in Ibiza. I didn't think there's any need to criticise that. And she seems to understand her people from up north and relate to them. And I think that's kind of cool. We don't have enough of that. But I can't relate to anyone. These are the people at uni I didn't want to hang out with.
Yeah.
These are the people if in business I had to deal with them, I would hang up and say, I can't do business with you. We've seemed to have attracted an incompetent elite class who do not understand the real world.
But there's quite a bit to unpack there.
Sorry about
that. Right. The answer to this might be all of them. But is the problem that leading politicians are, not smarter than the average bear, and we are, attracting mediocre, talented people with, barely average IQs, when you need people with very high IQs and a whole range of other skills? Is that the problem? Or is the problem that you don't want to hang out with them? You see, that doesn't really bother me that much. I don't care. Really.
Well, no, but for example, I can criticise Nigel Farage a lot. But he goes for a pint. And you see him go for a pint and he wants to have a fag. I'm like, oh, he's a normal person. I look at Rupert Lowe and I think, okay, you've lived a completely different life from you, but I know what I'm going to talk to you about. Talk to you about Southampton probably, or chairman issues. But I look at all these, they all look the same, dress the same, and talk the same. Yeah. And what I mean is I didn't want to hang out with them. I didn't hang out with the uni because they're at the uni debates, and they're not real people who understand the real world. I've considered going into politics locally in Bedford. Our mayor is rubbish, Tom Wootard, Conservative mayor, but he's absolutely useless. And I've thought about doing it because I understand the people of Bedford. I understand what they need. I think I'm a normal person. I don't think we're getting normal, relatable people. And there's another part.
But why do you think that is?
Because why would you go into politics? I'm going to earn much more money in the private sector, and I have done, right?
Mm-hmm.
To go into politics, I got a time where I don't need the money, and like Rupert, I'll just give the money away. Mm-hmm. And I think the incentives are such that people are scared to not toe party line and scared to be authentic. She was scared to be authentic.
Yeah.
But perhaps, I don't know, I shouldn't answer for her. So I just think we've got this kind of like very average group of people with little integrity. They haven't got the bollocks to go out there and be honest.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I've never met Bridget Phillipson, as far as I'm aware. And yeah, I'm not trying to. I'm feeling we're beating up on her a bit too much now.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was that she wasn't being honest. I don't think she was genuinely inside raging about what had occurred in this classroom and thought it was best not to express that. I don't think she was raging inside.
Yeah,
I think she was honest. Her honest position is she doesn't think she should have an opinion. That is actually her honest position. I've got no reason to believe she was being dishonest. That makes it worse, by the way. So, yeah, I mean, to change this, parties are going to have to, look more at what type of candidates they select. I mentioned to you at the top of the show, I think the Conservative Party needs to democratise a lot more. Unfortunately, all of the main parties have become these sort of machines in which you need to prove you were the vice chairman of the debating society and you've delivered X thousand leaflets in Y by-elections and have, worn out 10 pairs of shoes, prancing around, canvassing in various pointless, hopeless seats. That has to change. I hesitate to say, I don't really want normal people to be politicians. I want super normal people to be politicians. Right?
Sure. No, I'll give you another analogy. Okay, football. Remember the Premier League when it first came out? Mm-hmm. Your Tony Adams, your Stuart Pearces, your Chris Waddles, your characters, right?
Matt
Letizia. He's a wild one as well. Yeah. I showed my son one point. I was like, you've got to see his greatest goals. Yeah. Jesus, his goals are unbelievable. I forgot how good they were. But they were characters. They were interesting. Who's your characters in football now?
Yes, that's true.
It's been all kind of curved out of them.
But the interesting thing is I think I can explain why that's the case in football, whereas I don't think I can explain why that's the case in politics. In football, since the 80s or the 90s, it has become a massively bigger, more professionalised operation, right? Gone are the days, I know you were mentioning the formation of the Premier League in 1992, but roll back a bit before that, gone are the days where, the players would win a match, go down the pub and get absolutely bladdered,
But it is happening. We know that still happens.
Well, it happens a bit. No, I think the fitness regime players are on. There's no comparison to the 60s, 70s or 80s. Matt Letizia wouldn't make it as a professional player now. He ate burgers, didn't give a damn about his diet. So the Premier League, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would not be surprised if the turnover of the top division of English football has gone up by a factor of, 50 over my lifetime in real terms. So it has become a professionalised mega corporation, for better or worse. And if we're going to be paying you £10 million a year to kick a spherical piece of leather around the park rather than £100,000 a year to kick a spherical piece of leather around the park, you are going to lose a bit of your waistline, and you are going to be in the gym at 6:30 every morning, and this matters.
And media trained as
well.
And
media trained. So the whole thing has become a mega corporation football with some upsides and some downsides, right? Politics, that hasn't happened in politics particularly. I'm trying to work out what's changed over the course of the last, so the Premier League's been around for just over 30 years now. What's changed in politics since the 80s or the 90s?
Well, I think that I would say the biggest changes for politics is we are in an era now where everything you pretty much do or say could be recorded or seen. Everything you're involved in is judged on social media. And these people have their career incentives.
But hang on, but that should surely attract then those who are good at it. You would have thought that back in the day, the equivalent of Bridget Phillipson from the 1960s could probably got away with that because GB News didn't exist, or there was hardly any news on television. And if you were a bit of a boring blank with no opinions, you could get. Now, surely the advent of social media and there being 6,000 television channels that we can all watch 24 hours a day would surely mean that those who are better in that area would rise to the top.
What would her salary be about?
120,000.
120,000. How long does it take her to get to that point? What are the steps she has to go through, like juniors or whatever?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, I think an MP salary is, 85, 90,000, there or thereabouts. And you get add-ons for being a junior minister or a cabinet minister. That's what I'm guessing, about 120,000. Look, it's not a fantastic salary, but it's not a bad salary, right? And it's worth saying that there's quite a lot of perks involved. I mean, the pension is pretty damn good. Your living expenses are covered. My experience of having known, and worked alongside with a lot of MPs, is you get a lot of hidden benefits as well. You're hardly ever paying for your own dinner. Yeah. You're sort of eating out 4 nights a week. Not a bad lifestyle. So I think when you actually, and the other thing, if you and I are sort of free market types, if you believe in supply and demand, generally speaking, when a vacancy comes up for a safe seat, you don't want for applicants, right? Lots of people want to be the, Labour MP for blah, blah, or the Tory MP for somewhere else. So there seems to be a lot of demand out there in the open market from people who want to be MPs at these sort of salaries. I'd understand if we had an election in which nobody ran, you might sort of think, well, blimey, perhaps 87,500 quid's not enough to attract the talent. That's how a business would operate. So I agree with you in the diagnosis of the symptoms, but I must admit I'm at a loss to explain it. But perhaps it's another thing that is changing.
Is it the process?
Trump and Farage and Millet and folk of this sort of ilk, okay, I mean, there's obviously those three are not completely peas of the same pod, but the ability to quickly, swiftly change the narrative and grab attention, perhaps that now is the winning ticket. And if it is, then nature will ensure that those people or people like them rise to the top.
Could it be the process that beats it out of you? Like to make it politically, you kind of can't rock the boat too much. You have to stay aligned to people. You can't really be controversial and piss people off. Is it that, or is it that we've just got maybe we've gone through a period of political correctness and people don't want to offend anyone, and that's what the culture we've created. But actually, culture now is that we all know we're fallible. We all make mistakes. I've done so many stupid things in my life. Actually, I quite like a politician who's fucked up in life, who's made some mistakes. It's like, they're normal. Yeah. Maybe it's that.
Maybe it's that. I mean, the other thing worth saying is that, despite the fact that, we're spending way too much time destroying Bridget Phillipson and probably a bit too much praising Nigel Farage's drinking and smoking, politics does require discipline, right? I mean, if you are serious about winning an election campaign, you need to be able to do more than come up with a witty line over a beer and a fag at the Dog and Duck when you're speaking to some ordinary voters. You need to be able to repeat the same slogan over and over and over again. I do agree with the law of politics that only once you have bored yourself to death with the arguments you're putting might there be any chance that it's got any traction with your audience. Discipline is required, but perhaps it is that. Perhaps it is just too straitjacketed. And it is too easy to rise without trace. I think the electorate are going to start to put pay to that, though. I think radicals and mavericks are going to find, of all stripes, by the way, are going to find that, they go down quite well. And let's think of examples from the other side of the spectrum. George Galloway, Jeremy Corbyn, all right, didn't make it as Prime Minister, but, led the Labour Party in 2 elections. Hardly I'm going to think twice before saying nothing type politician, certainly not Galloway. So I'm expecting that the more forthright, clear, transparent communicators are likely to rise to the top, and that the era of the Sunaks and the Starmers being likely to emerge as leaders of their respective political parties probably drawing to a close.
When you've looked at this kind of radical reforms needed, obviously from an economic think tank. How much work have you done actually looking at where the radical reforms on the economics can come from? Because like I said, I've been through the OBR's website. I've looked at where we're spending money, and you can apportion a bit here, a bit there. But really, if we're 10% over each year, if we're, what is it, 1 trillion the government brings in, and they're spending 1.1 about
round terms. Yeah.
Do we need like a 20% cut? So is that kind of a target? And where do you find 20%?
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Yeah, this is a great question, and we're right to worry about it, and it won't be long before we've got to panic about it, right? Because my rough judgment is that if you look at, year-on-year spend, don't completely panic about, right? If I, in 2024, spend 10% more than I've earned in 2024, I'm not going to bankrupt myself. And I could probably do that for a few years before the going gets tough. The problem is actually enormously bigger than this. So when Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer go around saying, we inherited a £22 billion black hole, I don't believe that specific number has any legitimacy to it. But let's be honest, that's the least of our goddamn worries, right? Yeah. Being worried about a supposed £22 billion black hole is the equivalent of being worried that your house is burning down because you left a tenner behind the sofa. The overall financial catastrophe we face is we are, in rough terms, about £7 trillion in debt.
I thought it was 2.7.
Our on-cash balance sheet debt is about that 100% of GDP. Thereabouts, almost bang on 100% of GDP.
Actually, we had it up earlier, didn't we? No, it's 125% now.
Is it? No, it hasn't gone that high.
2.7 trillion. Do you remember that website? What was it, Con?
Well, the official number, I think, is like 99.8% of GDP. And what is GDP? Oh, mate, the 2.7 trillion sounds about right. That's about UK GDP. Anyway, in round terms, the cash deficit, those are all of the liabilities that we have taken on and have no means of paying, right? So this is the equivalent of me being my entire salary in debt, but also having made endless contractual obligations, in the case of the government, to public sector pensions, state pensions, National Health Service from cradle to grave, that if you were to put all of those in, as if the government was a private company and had to list its actual liabilities, the directors would be in prison because this amount can't be paid for. So the whole is roughly terms, £7 trillion, not 22 billion. And to my mind, that is going to require, and the sooner we do it, the less painful it will be. Let me have a look at this.
What website is this, Con? Commodity.com. So scroll up. This is United Kingdom debt clock, 2.7 trillion. That's from the UK government data, ONS. And if you go down, our GDP is 2.1 trillion, so 125%. I keep an eye on that number. There's this economist called Lynn Alden who I follow, and she says 135% is the event horizon.
Right.
Of the 52 countries that have gone over 135%, only one, I think 51 have had a currency default. The other one was Japan, the outlier with the stagnation.
Well, that graph's quite interesting. I mean, I've never been much taken by the view that there is a specifically know it in advance inflection point. Maybe you can get to 136%, 137%. And then I think other, it's multifaceted. Other things matter. If you're 135% in debt as a cash balance, that might not matter very much if you are generally bringing down spending year on year, deregulating the economy, economic growth is 12% per annum. You probably have the markets looking at you quite benevolently. If you're not as bad as 100% of GDP, but you're going completely in the wrong direction and in danger of triggering recessions, they're not going to look at you so fondly. So, I mean, look, the truth of the position is that the present trajectory is unsustainable, right? And that's not really an ideological point. It's a mathematical point. And the great things about things that are unsustainable is that they aren't sustained. Literally unsustainable. So how do you go about that? And I would say that the correct approach is you don't try and trim from various government programs. When fiscal consolidations have happened, those have typically failed. For example, the one under the coalition government basically kept government spending flat. You need to look at whole swathes of government and end them. So to put another way, you're much better to completely shut down 10% of government programs than you are to reduce every government program by 10%. I could actually remember, I think it was with Ed Vaizey I might have had this argument, but whoever the Tory culture minister was back in the day. And the rough plan was they were going to cut, for sake of argument, Arts Council funding by 10 or 15% or something. And I said, don't bother. Either cut it by 100% or don't bother cutting it at all, right? Because the howls that you're going to get from the Arts Council and the lovey establishment will be just as loud whether you cut by 15 or 100%.
Well, this is what Steve Baker said to me. He said, I think it was Steve, he said, when we had our Conservative Party austerity programme, we knew we were going to be unpopular. So our biggest problem, we just didn't cut anywhere deep enough.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Then if you were to look at, where are the prime candidates for spending reductions? Well, if you add up healthcare, welfare and education, you're looking at not far off 2/3 of the government budget.
There you go.
I'm not saying that you can't find funding, from the Department of Transport, procuring paper clips more cheaply or something. You should probably try and do that as well. But the big chunky stuff, it's hard to see how you could get this enormously under control without looking very seriously at those three areas of government spending. And I think my broad approach to this, but as I say, it would require this upstream institutional change. There's no way the OBR or the civil service, if I was suddenly magically became Prime Minister, I wouldn't get anywhere near to achieving it. But the broad approach needs to be, we need to make opting out of the state system easier. Right.
Okay.
So exactly. I mean, you might say the complete reverse of the Labour government's approach to private education, where they're taxing it. So what's going to happen here, to some degree, is that the amount that the state has to spend on education is going to rise. Yes. We don't yet know by how much, but some people are going to leave private school and go into the state sector. You want to encourage this the other way round, and for example, school fees to be in some way tax deductible, and you encourage people to exit the state sector. I would revert to the previous policy we had on private medical insurance as well.
What was the previous policy there?
That you could write off private medical insurance against tax.
Interesting. Right? I tell you why that's interesting. So I first got private medical, when was it? When I started in London. God, that was probably 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And for me and the kids, it used to be, I think when I first had my kids on it, it was about £150 a month for the three of us,
right,
for Vitality's best coverage, mm-hmm, including full cancer care. I've now, it's higher because I've had back surgery, Connor's had shin splints, and I'm a bit older.
You've lost your no claims bonus, yeah.
Yeah, but it's still only about 250 quid a month.
Right, yeah.
And I would lose Sky Sports before I lose this, because when I had my back surgery, I went in for the consultation. I was in surgery 3 days later in a private hospital. It's brilliant. Mm-hmm. It's fucking brilliant. I tell all my friends to do it. I've got so many friends who can afford it who don't have it. And I keep thinking, how can we incentivize more people to just get into that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the market, you incentivize it by it being an attractive thing to do. And the problem you've got at the moment, I mean, you've decided, I have private medical insurance as well. I think it's about the same, actually. I mean, I'm in my early 50s, a bit more than £2,000 a year, something like that. But But you could see the argument that, well, I'm having to pay for my NHS coverage anyway, so that's a kind of sunk cost. This is £2,000 on top, which I agree with you that I happen to consider it worth it. But surely more people would consider it worth it, especially if we sort of said, look, if you're earning reasonable money, I don't know, you're a higher rate taxpayer, right? So you're paying the 40p income tax rate. We really think you should get out of the NHS queue and that you should pay for your own private medical care. But I don't think you can just make that a kind of clarion call of morality. I mean, we do that a bit with the winter fuel allowance. If you don't need the winter fuel allowance, give it away to charity. But obviously you're still personally incentivised to trouser it yourself, even if you're a millionaire. So I would like something along the lines of saying, right, well, you can write this off against your tax bill, and you will perhaps not have access to NHS services. Similarly, on welfare, this will take a time to sort of grandfather this out of the system. But I would be quite interested in my income tax or national insurance contributions falling in return for me saying I will not claim the state pension. Right, so I don't actually want your state pension, thanks very much. And you might sort of split the difference here a bit, right? It's because if we want to get the public finances into some sort of order, it might be that, the whole gain of me coming out isn't borne by me. Some of it is borne by the government. But I'm off their books as a liability now. Now, exactly what hoops you need to jump through, would you need to show that you've already made, which I have in my case, my own private pension provision, so I'm not going to need to fall back on the state pension, I'll be poorer for not having it, but I can prove that I don't need it, even if I retired today. I think you start doing those sort of things. So you find mechanisms by which folk are incentivised to no longer rely on the expensive side of public services, welfare, health and education. And you take the snapshot of what we've got at the moment, in rough terms, £7 trillion figure, if you look at all of the liabilities, and you just bank that and you say, well, we're going to have to deal with that over a course of time. We're clearly not going to say to Mrs. Miggins, aged 86, that we are scrapping your state pension, get back out to work, love. We've got to make an actuarial judgment of how much longer Mrs. Miggins is going to live and put that onto that side of the ledger, and slowly but surely whittle that down and run budget surpluses for the next 50 years.
Why is it other countries in Europe, because I've had a look, why are they able to operate with much lower taxes?
Which?
Bulgaria?
Oh, well, Central Eastern Europe, yes. Yeah. I mean, Scandinavia, no.
Yeah, well, they're pretty commie.
We're about in the... Oh, it's interesting. I'll come back on that, actually. I don't quite agree with you on there. I think there's a few lessons to be learnt from Scandinavia.
I don't know, man. I went out to Norway recently.
Norway, all right. Denmark and Sweden I was looking more to. Okay. We'll come back to that in a minute. Hold that thought. Well, I mean, I genuinely don't know the answer to this. I'm fielding a guess. What is the Bulgarian state pension? Is it triple locked? And is it £12,000 sterling per annum? What is the Bulgarian health service provision to its citizenry? How generous is that to all Bulgarian citizens? So my guess would be because they spend a lot less than we do.
So that's what the opt-out is now. The opt-out you're talking about here is people actually moving to those countries.
Yes, of course, you can do that. And that's happening. I mean, that is of itself a worry. I mean, we haven't touched too much on immigration, but we've just seen as we're recording today the statistics that last year net immigration was not far off 1,906,000, I think the number was.
Did it fall though?
It has now fallen, I think, to 750,000. But I mean, that's still a colossal number of people coming in. And by and large, generalisation, klaxon alert, what's the problem that's happening? By and large, generalisation, those who are coming in are at the lower end of the income spectrum and therefore typically net beneficiaries from the system. Not all of them. That 906,000 will include some Premier League footballers who are earning millions of pounds a year, but by and large, as a cohort, they are going to be net beneficiaries, not net contributors. And at the other end, we are losing millionaires more rapidly than any country in the world other than China. Well, this really does make what is already an unsustainable public finance position a million times worse. But I think you've got to you've got to get people away from being reliant on the state sector, and you've got to be patient and do this over time. That's why I say you can't. You can give me the option to forgo my state pension for some kind of benefit, or to forgo the NHS for some kind of benefit. So I think the NHS comes in at costing about £3,000 per person per year, something like that. So supposing you were to take somebody like me, I'm 52, so I guess probably about average of the population. I'm not especially old yet, so I probably am about £3,000 would probably be the anticipated cost. Well, I think you'd still have to offer me accident and emergency cover. Right? I'm not going to have a privatised ambulance if I'm hit by a bus on the way home, but that would be a fairly modest amount. Everything else, let's say it's £500 for that, for sake of argument. £2,500 is all the other care that I would have got. Perhaps you don't give me £2,500 back if I say I'm willing to get out of the queue. Perhaps you give me £2,000 back. So the government's, if you like, made a £500 profit per annum on that transaction of me opting out. And, perhaps you do something similar with schools as well. You don't give the full benefit to the people who are opting out. You sort of split the difference somehow. But you give them an incentive. And I think that would make, and that would then bring more supply to the market. If you believe more and more people would, if you believe a good number of people would want that decision on the NHS and would choose private healthcare, that will bring more supply to the market. And sort of inch by inch you win it, not by looking at the spot price figures and thinking, Christ almighty, how do I save £87 billion this year? But by putting yourself on a trajectory in which you can see if we can continue in this direction, then the public finances are indeed sustainable rather than completely spiralling out of control. That would be my broad approach to it, and patient and long-term.
Right. Okay. So talk to me about Scandinavia, because let me tell you my experience in Norway. It was my third time going there, and everything works.
Yeah. But beer's £25 a pint.
Yeah. Well, no. So I remember getting off the. So I got off the plane and went out to get a taxi. They're all of them are Teslas.
Right.
Probably mandated. Yeah. Because it's Norway. And the guy picks me up, and I'm always interested. I always want to talk to people. I said, "What's life like here?" It's like, pretty miserable. It says I earn good money, but the government's taking nearly all of it. I don't have much left at the end of it. Public services are good, but I've just got no money. But I also know they're still running out of money anyway, because they tried to do their wealth tax, didn't they? To raise,
that's right.
What was it? To raise 160 million, and so many the rich people left. They actually had a 460 million deficit.
Is that right?
Yeah. Pretty sure that was. And then it's a weird. Norway's a weird place. Yeah. Very weird place. Oslo's very strange. But so I went around speaking to people, and everyone just said, "We've got no money. We're rich, but we have no money."
Well, that is an odd contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Norway is somewhat exceptional because of the oil-based nature of the economy, right? So I think it's quite difficult to derive too many lessons from Norway. But if you were to take, say, Denmark and Sweden, and I'm not holding these up as absolute paradigms of libertarian utopia, don't get me wrong. I'm just questioning the view that these are Polly Toynbee style woke democracies. They are to some degree, but not entirely. The tax rate, overall tax take in Sweden and Denmark is about the same as the UK, a nudge higher, right? A nudge higher. And therefore it suits the sort of Polly Toynbees of the world to say, and the Owen Joneses of the world to sort of say, look, there's perfectly nice countries over there and their tax are higher than ours. But it's only by an absolute whisker. Similarly, if you were to look at Sweden, and this goes back to my trajectory point, tax take as a proportion of GDP has gone down monumentally since the 1980s. So when the Social Democratic Party of Sweden was the hegemonic political party, you were looking at the state side of the economy amounting to nearly 70% of GDP. It's now down to, high 40s, perhaps 50% of GDP. So it goes back to my trajectory argument, right? The story of Sweden has been that the government sector has been getting smaller. Still bloody enormous, but getting smaller. And that's the sort of, I want us to get on that trajectory as well, albeit we're not starting as high as 70% of GDP being controlled by the state. So they have moved in that direction. In a number of areas, they did actually unwind this. Sweden were willing to have a free schools program that allowed you to set up schools for profit. Michael Gove thought this was a bit too much of a pill for the lefty Brits to swallow. No British Conservative government could be quite as right-wing as Sweden on actually allowing the profit motive in creating a chain of schools, and I don't see why not. I mean, if you can run a chain of hotels and make a profit, why can't you run a chain of schools and make a profit? Denmark, quite interesting as well. It's worth saying that these countries also have very generous welfare systems, but I do treat that a bit differently to a big state, right? So although there's waste in it and I wouldn't want it to happen, if you've got high tax and high benefits and it just sort of nets off and there's an awful lot amount of fiscal churn, I don't consider that to be an enormously intrusive state, so I'd be against it because I'm a small state sort of guy. But I don't know, if the government was forcing me to save 12% of my income into a ring-fenced pension fund, I don't think they should, but that to my mind isn't the same as the government running the healthcare system or the government, running the transport system. So once you look at how generous their welfare is, which is obviously a high tax level, it's sort of money sloshing around. And of course, some cohorts will do well out of it, some cohorts not so well out of it. But that is not a kind of deep, intrusive state in the way that the government, running all of our healthcare from cradle to grave, I think is. In Denmark, they don't have a minimum wage. The first thing to kick anyone who says, why can't we be more like the Scandies, is I agree. I think we should be like Denmark. There should not be a minimum wage.
I completely agree.
You can hire and fire at will in Denmark. Very easy to fire somebody. Much less strict employment laws than we've got in the United Kingdom. So I suppose my only point is say mixed picture. And it's not entirely, it's a good rule of thumb, but it's not entirely a question of how high is our tax rate and does that show how socialist we are. Imagine we had... I'm not in favour of a universal basic income, but at all. But imagine we had that, and our tax rate was, a nudge higher than it is at the moment. But the only thing different was every single citizen gets a £10,000 cheque on the 1st of January every year. Well, I'm not sure I support that welfarism, but it's not a hugely intrusive, inefficient way for the state to behave per se, right? Whereas when the government starts trying to run businesses and regulate businesses, it is. So that's my modest rider on Scandinavia. I'm not holding it up as the living, breathing example, but neither do I think it's a commie nightmare.
Well, that's why I quite like what you said there about Denmark. I dislike the minimum wage. I'd much rather the free market sorts it out. It's frustrating. I own a bar, that's one of my businesses, that we have a minimum wage set for there. I actually pay above the minimum wage because I choose to outperform other businesses. But I know there's other places whereby they would want a lower minimum wage, and there's probably 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds happy to take that because they're living with their parents. And I hate this rebranding of a living wage. I think it's misleading. But I love this hire and firing at will. I wish I could I don't think you should sack people for discriminatory reasons, but if somebody's shit at their job, you should be able to get rid of them like you can in the US. Those things I do like. I would support. But why are governments so scared of free markets? How do we get to this point where there's so much bureaucracy, red tape and interference?
Well, because it's a feature, not a bug of government, right? It
feels like a bug.
Well, it's a bug for the free market. Well, it's a pain for the free market. But the entire proposition of having, a Minister for Employment Rights, you've already now accepted that the free market cannot be left to its own devices, right? That you have literally accepted right up front that there is market failure. And we therefore need a minister for milk pricing or whatever, which we used to have back in the day. Price of milk set by some bloody committee. So once you allow government into these areas, it becomes understandably, not efficiently or benevolently, but understandably, the mode of thinking. If I'm the minister for football with a whole platoon of civil servants who are my football policy advisors, in addition to no doubt getting a few decent free tickets to some Premier League football matches, we will be going around looking for problems for us to fix. So it is the old definition of Marxism, isn't it? That politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere and diagnosing it wrongly and applying the wrong solutions. That was Groucho Marx, not Karl Marx, who said that. So that's the way that you're automatically geared once you are the Ministry for Football. And there's you as the Minister for Football and a squad of advisors around you. What else would you do? I mean, it would be lovely to think that these people would be sort of principled libertarians who would go and beg the people up the line to close down their department. But there isn't enough of that. That's something else I wonder whether we could incentivise, actually, to say to those who work in government offices or civil service programs, if you can permanently shut down a program, we will give you a very, very generous redundancy check for the next 5 years, but the program must not come back. But wherever you look, so I'll bore you with an anecdote of, it's about 10, 12 years ago now. For some reason, can't remember why. I was at the time of the coalition austerity, I was invited to go and speak to some meeting of the Fire Brigade Union. And I knew I was going to be going into completely hostile territory. But their argument was, look, it's completely miraculous. What a brilliant job we're doing, is that the number of people killed in fires in Britain every year is sort of collapsing, and the amount of damage, financial damage done by fire every year is collapsing. Aren't we absolutely fantastic? To which I said, well, sort of thanks for that, so we can shut you down then, can't we? I mean, why on earth do we need the same number of firemen as we did 25 years ago? That, the invention of smoke alarms and all of the rest, and generally speaking, putting aside the tragedy of sort of Grenfell, generally speaking, safer building, let's shut you down. Oh my God, you can't do that. Here's proof that we're more and more successful. And I said, it's an absolutely absurd argument. It'd be like me having me being in charge of, say, the office for keeping killer elephants out of London, and me going back every year and saying, what a success I've had. Not a single killer elephant has been spotted anywhere in London. I'm hitting my targets. Keep funding me. Not only that, I could do with a bigger budget to make sure there aren't any killer rhinoceroses either. So the whole mode and mindset of people in the bureaucratic machine is geared in that fashion. It starts from the premise, assumption or assertion that there is market failure. And then you are personally incentivized by your own advancement to find market failures or supposed market failures and solve them. So all of this is just explained by incentives. It's not surprising, really.
At Ledden, we built the best Bitcoin-backed loan platform in the world. Proven, trusted, growing. Ledden's proven track record speaks for itself. Visit ledden.io/Mr. Obnoxious to get started. Ledden, there is no second best. Ledden is not regulated in the United Kingdom. Any credit products or virtual asset services provided by Ledden are not subject to UK regulatory protections. Please consider the risks associated with virtual assets and consult a financial advisor before making any decisions.
Can I tell you a naive idea I have? I think it's naive. It might be smart. So we've just had a general election, and Labour have pretty much not kept to anything they said in their manifesto. Mm-hmm. They've just lied to us. Yeah. Rather than have a manifesto, why don't we have an election where each party sets its budget? We vote based on the budget. And if they don't keep to their budget, they're out. Why can't we have that? Because with something like that, the incentive then is it switches the incentives. The incentives are that, well, we must be efficient and we must be able to deliver a lower budget, deliver for the citizens. Otherwise... Yeah. So, well, okay. There must be some naivety. Yeah.
Okay, well, no, I mean, I like what you're grasping for here.
Yeah.
But I think it is quite problematic because the future is not certain. And one of the great problems that I have with the way the state operates is it enormously overstates the level of certainty about what's going to happen this year, next year, all of the rest. So let's take the budget, for example, right? One thing that you need to feature is, what's your anticipated or predicted growth rate for the next 12 months? And if you're out by a bit, this is going to hit your budget by a lot, right? Now, you might have very clear reasoning that you think that GDP is going to go up 3% next year, in which case that will filter into your tax revenues. It will also filter into other things about, presumably that shows more and more people entering the workforce rather than leaving the workforce. That's your assumption as you're putting this budget together. Let's say your assumption either turns out to be wrong or some external shock screws it up. A pandemic, for example, right? Or a war, or a natural disaster. Or just simply the fact that you thought there was going to be 3% growth and it turns out there's only 2.6% growth.
But that's the same for my household budget or my company budgets. I operate with uncertainty on both of them.
No, that's true. And the mechanism we have is after 5 years, we can sack you.
No,
right?
it's so long.
It may be long, right?
Look, with my house, I pretty much month to month have to make sure I pay my mortgage, and if I don't, so I have to plan for that. And with my companies, I have to make payroll every month, or I lose employees. But government get 5 years. It's just it just irks me that.
Well, they do get 5 years, and of course, effectively, they can't go bust, right? And that's they don't have the market discipline. If you run your own business appallingly, and all of your staff leave, and you spend vast amounts of money on vanity projects that go nowhere, that you decide, I don't know, you're going to invest heavily in a ludicrous railway line between London and Birmingham, for example, you will very quickly not have a business. Whereas, unfortunately, government failure does not lead us very quickly to not having a government. It just leads within a few years to us having a change of government.
Or do we need a mechanism to punish failing government?
Democracy is supposed to be that mechanism, right? And you might argue that there is something of a feedback loop between elections as well. But, generally speaking, with, say, Labour tanking in the opinion polls at the moment, there might be some feedback loop that makes them think, oh, God, we don't really care about immigration, but we'd better do something about it because, look, we've just lost this by-election, or we're down to 25%, or our approval ratings are low. So there is some sort of feedback loop. It doesn't work anything like as well as the market. I agree. Markets tend to be efficient. Politics tends to be inefficient. I mean, if we're into the sort of putting mad ideas on the table, again, just to sort of say, just as a complete thought experiment, why don't we actually strip away the budget from politicians altogether, other than they set the tax rate, right? So they decide whether we're paying 20% basic rate of tax, or 40% higher rate, or 45% top rate, whatever. They set the income tax rate. Then and I'll focus just on income tax for the purpose of this argument, it makes it simpler. Then let's say, I don't know, I'm paying 25 grand a year in income tax. At the end of each year, I get a letter from Her Majesty of Revenue and Customs, firstly thanking me, rather than sort of saying, well, if you don't reply to this by time X, we're going to fine you. And if we've made an error, it's all your fault anyway. Thank you very much. A wonderful contribution to society. You're in the top 2% of contributors. This will enable us to do all sorts of wonderful things. Here attached is your ballot paper with a list of government departments down one side and boxes down the other. And you fill in the numbers so they add up to £25,000. And that's how your £25,000 will be allocated to each government department. So if you are passionate about international development aid, you might want to put it all in that box. I want all £25,000 to go on foreign aid. If you're less passionate about foreign aid and more passionate about, I don't know, education or the winter fuel allowance or whatever, you could put it in that box. Potentially, with technology now, you could unfurl it even further than that. You could sort of say, well, I want £5,000 to go into the education box, but I can now then open other tabs to say that I want it to go for primary school education or special needs or whatever. You could. So each person, I'm still forced to pay the 25 grand, right? That I can't get out of. I can't just sort of, but I now allocate it, and you count them all up, and that's the budget you'll be getting next year, guys. And
has anyone tried this?
I don't know. I mean, I can see all sorts of practical, when it comes to the rubber hitting the road, practical problems with it. That's why I say it's a thought experiment. But the intriguing thing it would bring in would be that government departments would have to compete against each other for your business, right? So I, as the Minister for Health, would have to be saying, this is why I really want you to put at least 20% into health, because these are all the wonderful things we're doing. And if I was the Minister for International Development Aid, I'd have to do the same. I want you to put at least 5% into international development aid. So now, I mean, could it really work in the real world? I don't know. It's a thought experiment. But technology does enable these sorts of things to at least be considered in the future, right? This could all be done online in that sort of fashion, and then starts to unleash all sorts of dynamic effects. As I say, government ministries competing against each other for what slice of the pie they're going to get. So you'd have to have, a compelling case from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport about why they needed a slice of your money. And the people will decide and allocate accordingly. You'd probably have to ring fence off various things. I don't know if halfway through building a nuclear missile and then defence takes a hit in the next budget round. I don't quite know how you do it and whether you do it every year or whether there needs to be floors and ceilings. But it's like, at least as a thought experiment, I wonder whether we might start to see democracy moving in that direction. More direct decision-making by the voters. Oftentimes this is said, should we just have more referendums? But, is it actually possible now for quite micro decisions to be made by individuals rather than our elected representatives? I think that's at least a question worth asking ourselves.
I've got to ask, actually, because I mentioned my background of what this podcast was, and obviously you're an economic think tank. Have you looked at Bitcoin?
A little bit. I must confess, I don't quite understand it. And you said before we went on air, you're the expert here. Wow. I mean, I've got some broad brush views on cryptocurrency. I think fine. I mean, I'm not against them or banning them or anything like that. It's not completely obvious to me, I should say, so perhaps you can inform me about this in monosyllabic terms that I would understand, what Bitcoin brings to the market that gold doesn't. So I can totally understand why you might want to get out of fiat state currency and into a secure and limited alternative. But why Bitcoin rather than gold, silver, platinum, or fine art?
That's a good question. And some people have them all. I think there's a few things. Okay, firstly, I can go on my phone right now, and instantly buy some Bitcoin, and I take control of that Bitcoin. I self-custody it.
You can do that with gold, can
you? I won't have instant delivery of the gold. The gold, I'd either have it ordered and sent to my house, and I'd have to find a way of storing it. But also, I can pay for things easily with Bitcoin. So when I went out to El Salvador, El Zonte, where the kind of Bitcoin project started, almost everywhere there now accepts Bitcoin. So I've been 5 times. I used to take dollars. Last time I didn't because I could pay Bitcoin everywhere. So I think it's better for payments because it's right. So if you start from the starting point, I can self-custody it. It is a bare instrument that I control, but I can go into places, instantly pay for it. Obviously, with gold, it's not really a good.
I'm surprised to hear that. I'm surprised there isn't a gold app in which the gold is never sent to your house or whatever. You just own a little fraction of whatever's in Fort Knox, and you can transfer that between currencies at Tesco's.
But you don't have self-custody. So if you think back to, I know.
Oh, I see what you mean. You're still reliant on Fort Knox not being bombed or raided or something.
Or Executive Order 6102 where they took the gold. You have that situation. So you have that centrally managed issue, whereas I can literally send you some right now and you've got it. So that's it. I can also teleport it around the world instantly. So there was a time, me and Con, we went out to Japan. I did an interview and we had a camera guy there came out and serviced us. I couldn't get from my money from Lloyd's Bank into his bank account. And I was like, do you take Bitcoin? He said, yes. So I sent it. So in terms of the ability to kind of move it around, it's a lot easier. That's the starting point. I also think it's kind of suits the world we're in now. We're in a digitized world. If you offer me a digital form of gold versus lumps of a yellow rock, it's a bit more suitable to the internet. They're the kind of the two main things. But also there's this transparent ledger where I can audit the amount of Bitcoin that's out there. Whereas with gold, it's a bit hard. It's harder to audit it. So, I mean, they're the main reasons I like it, and I have a preference for it. I've kept, for the last 7 years, I pretty much keep most of my money in Bitcoin, and because keeping money in the bank just inflates away. So they're the reasons I like it. And I'm starting to see more and more people understand it. I've seen there's like pension funds in the US that have started moving money to Bitcoin. BlackRock have got into Bitcoin with the ETF. Vanguard have got into Bitcoin. Trump's talking about a national Bitcoin reserve. There's a lot more people starting to realize, like, as these fiat currencies are struggling under the mountain of debt, that they want hard assets.
I get all of that. And I'm attracted to it. And I'm attracted by its kind of ability to encourage libertarian naughtiness as well, right? That's just a huge appeal. And I think it's a feature of something wider that's occurring there. We've talked about how technology, in my slightly madcap, not thought through idea about how we could allocate government departmental budgets, how technology can liberate people. And roughly what's happening is, I think we are getting into a situation in which the state is going to find it increasingly hard to control the finances of its citizenry. and cryptocurrencies and the like. I mean, how if you start paying people in Bitcoin rather than in pounds, and it's all sort of off the books, well, how the hell does the inland revenue rake in whatever they should be raking in income tax? And I look at that as potentially a good thing. I mean, you would be breaking the law, but nevertheless, the ability of a government officer to tap you on your shoulder and to take his pound of flesh is surely diminishing with each passing year. Bitcoin is probably an element of that. I mean,
that's a really good point, because they do have the ability now. I think HMRC have the ability to go into your bank account and take money, and I think the government does on fines as well, on certain things as well. You can't stop that, and there might be a fine you disagree with. But with the Bitcoin, they can't do that because I custody it, so they can't come. They have to come to me, and I have to give it to them.
Yeah, I get that. So I mean, it goes to the crypto element of cryptocurrency, doesn't it? It's secret. But more generally, I mean, I'm got to be careful what I say here. I'm not going to say that I'm not worried about inflation and poor monetary policy by Western governments. I am worried about them. But I think it's becoming less and less of a problem. So, what kind of idiot keeps all of their money in sterling? I mean, I keep, I don't know, £10,000-15,000 in sterling, in case I suddenly need cash to replace the boiler or something, right? Like, that's probably overly cautious. I don't, but so, all right. And that's going to diminish at whatever it is, 5% per annum. So I'm holding that to keep it liquid. And probably I would be better off putting it in Bitcoin and getting this app or whatever, but just for the ease of, but I don't hold anything else in sterling. I get, paid in sterling, and I then convert it into assets. It needn't be Bitcoin. I could be improving my house, buying a new supercharged boiler, buying a new power shower, buying some stocks and shares. Yeah,
but you understand economics. I think a lot of people are now hand to mouth.
Right,
month by month. And a lot of people don't have the disposable income, or they're a bit nihilistic. Like that was my experience in Argentina, is that because the Argentina peso was debasing so quickly, people were just out I was surprised how busy the restaurants were.
Right,
and they said, "Oh, we'll just spend it while we can." And I
at one point had inflation so bad, I'm told, that you would ask if you could pay for your meal before you ate it, because 3 hours later the price could well have gone up.
So when I was in Venezuela, it's the first time I'd seen it. I went to a restaurant in Venezuela, and the prices were stickers.
Yeah,
because they changed them so regularly. But and even in Argentina, I was in a shop and she was changing the prices while I was there. So I've seen all that. But I think the great thing about Bitcoin is you can buy a small amount. You can buy £50 worth, £50 a week, and just forget about it.
Yeah.
I think investing in assets, a lot of people can't buy a second house, or they can't buy artwork. They don't really get gold. So I think sometimes.
But why don't they get? I mean, but they don't get Bitcoin either.
Potentially not. But I think people are being forced more and more to think about these things. Where can I put the money? It
becomes so much. So there was one thing I don't know whether it took off, but it nearly attracted me. Amongst my many weird interests, I'm very into American comic books.
Okay.
And the holy grail of American comic book collecting is Action Comics #1 from 1938, which is the first ever appearance of Superman in a comic book. And a reasonably decent copy of it would go for north of £1 million, right? I mean, it is the absolute holy grail. Or Detective Comics #27, which is the first appearance of Batman. Now, somebody was just set up. You can buy a share in it now, because there's no way I haven't got £1 million, and if I did, I wouldn't spend it all on Action Comics #1. But they were trying to get together 10,000 people to buy a slice of it, so you could have a slice of this comic book. It's slightly a hobbyist thing, but it might well go up in value. Sure. It's like fine art or the rest of it. Now,
I do the same with trainers, by the way.
Right.
I've got the Colorado. I've got 600 pairs of boxed, unopened trainers. Right. I started with a pair I bought before he was born, Nike Dunk Londons. They only made 202 pairs of them, and they cost me £120. This pair's like 20 grand now, Con?
Jeez.
Could be more.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm the same. Yeah. But it's this thing, but realizing you need scarce assets. I don't think there's a broad understanding of scarcity.
Oh, that's probably right. But again, I'm trying to work out what the solution is here. I mean, I'm much more confident, I think, than you're implying or I'm inferring from what you've said about the basic common sense of the average Brit. I don't think you need to have done an economics degree to be sort of thinking, well, what might I do in my old age if I haven't saved anything? I mean, we slightly strip away responsibility there because there's a sort of lazy assumption that the state will look after you with your state pension. I agree with you that I'm not trying to poo-poo that there aren't people who are living hand to mouth, but there must be a very large cohort of people who are not living hand to mouth, right? Who have got their 50 quid or 100 quid a month extra where they could save it or buy Bitcoin or buy a fraction of Action Comics #1 or whatever. And it seems to me that essentially what's happening is transaction costs are collapsing, right? So, Bitcoin is made possible by the fact you just click on that app and, there's no, I was brought up, writing checks for everything. I can't remember when I last wrote a check. So transaction costs have completely collapsed and your ability to buy things, invest things and all the rest of it. I'm on some app called Free Trade. You can buy shares over there. I just put a few hundred quid in for, a bit of a giggle in Wetherspoons and Aston Martin just to sort of see how it worked. So I'm pretty sure people will stumble across that. Not everybody. I mean,
You'd be surprised so I'm 46. You'd be surprised how many people in my cohort have no pension at all. Or if it is, it's a minimal contribution from their work and it's not going to pay for their retirement.
So what on earth are they thinking?
I don't know. This is the point. I think we've had such a squeeze on the middle class over the last 10, 15 years that, it's essentially 2 salaries needed for a house now, and to support a lifestyle that people want. I think people also they have probably a more advanced lifestyle for their own, as they say. My dad did.
Sure,
my dad had that culture of saving, but I just
we'll have to flip the house. That's
it. I mean, that's the reality. I think most people are thinking
that's not a problem, though, is it? I mean, what So if you got a house worth, I don't know, £500,000, that you don't downsize necessarily. You just cut a deal that upon the death of the second partner, the bank gets it. Give me £500,000 or whatever. So, I mean, I don't think the wisest thing to do to save for your old age is to put it all in bricks and mortar and then take the equity out of it. But it's not a disastrous plan.
If they own a house. I mean, my son's generation, I mean, it's hard for them to own a house. Really hard.
Yeah, it is. And we have housing. I mean, planning regulations. Absolute disaster. It's terrible. I mean, those are artificially inflated prices because the state has throttled the supply. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, we should be building. Well, I don't believe in a centrally planned target, but many, many hundreds of thousands of new homes every year. But interestingly, and I don't know whether this is good or bad for those of a kind of classical liberal libertarian inclination, we might well be getting to a stage where people don't want to and don't have to own stuff. One of my
it's just a Westerling, isn't it?
Well,
you'll own nothing and be happy.
Yeah, no, well, I don't quite want to go that far, but let's. So anecdote about my childhood, which sort of illustrates the point. I lived in a cul-de-sac with most of the families who were living there were similar ages to my parents, myself, and my sister. And the house just about opposite, they never had a wheelbarrow. And, several times a year, they would come over and knock on number 3 and say, "Oh, hello, Littlewood, can we please borrow your wheelbarrow?" And, yes, of course, no problem. And they do whatever they needed to do with the wheelbarrow, and the wheelbarrow would come back. I think they were the only house that didn't own a wheelbarrow. We definitely all owned lawnmowers. A few years later, we moved, and about 6 months after that, they moved quite close to our new house. And our thinking was that they still wanted to borrow the wheelbarrow and therefore moved house. Now, everybody owned a lawnmower. Everybody owned a car. Again, technology seems to me that we might start to move into this sort of digital nomad type place in which, everybody owned their best, Sunday crockery and all of that sort of stuff and kept their wedding dress and all of these sort of things. Ludicrous now, isn't it? I mean, I don't know whether an app exists for it, but I mean, how often do you need to use a lawnmower to mow your garden? I don't have my own garden, I don't know, but how many hours a year? I don't know.
Once a month, maybe?
Once a month, so let's say, I don't know, 25 hours a year?
Maybe, yeah.
Why would you buy and own a lawnmower when you can presumably click on an app, share it between the street, and therefore the actual amount of capital that each average person owns goes down in terms of these, I've got a wheelbarrow, I've got
it's zip car for the lawnmowers.
Zip car, quite. I mean, I haven't driven a car for 30 years. I think it's pretty odd that my driving license still allows me to, because I probably wouldn't be capable of driving a car now. Even clothing, or potentially, live your life in Airbnbs. Now, obviously, the fact that housing is too expensive would filter down into the Airbnb price. Hire a bloody wedding dress, rather than buy one. Okay, that's a special occasion.
Hold on, you don't understand women, do you?
But certainly, hire a tuxedo.
Yeah.
Hire if you want to put on a massive dinner party, hire the crockery rather than actually spending thousands that you only roll out at Christmas Day or whatever. So you're probably moving to a scenario in which what people own is just on here. Perhaps just Bitcoin, right? That's it. I've got this amount of Bitcoin. I don't own a house. I don't own a car. I don't own a wheelbarrow. I don't own a lawnmower. I do own some basic clothing, but for a tuxedo or anything posh, I'll go to hiretuxedo.com. If I need to drive somewhere, I go to zipcar.com. And I own nothing, but I am happy. Now, obviously, you've got to own the Bitcoin.
Schwab will be happy.
You've obviously got to own the Bitcoin. So there's still an investment here. But in terms of kind of the physical stuff, you'll access it and rent it quite possibly, rather than and this is hugely more efficient. Technology is therefore killing the transactions cost. Back in the 1970s, the hassle of working out the lawnmower rotor in Holmes Close, Wokingham wouldn't have been worth the candle. But now you can get people to walk your dog for you. You just click here, click here, click here. So that really does make the market more efficient, and I think will have a pretty substantial knock-on effect onto living standards. One wild idea I had was sort of the app I want is basically somebody to act as my personal agent, where the super rich might have their own PA and concierge or whatever. But I would have thought AI can get pretty close to just working things out, and a bit like Alexa, sort of Alexa, I'm going to need a tuxedo next Friday. Can you sort it out for me?
That's almost certainly coming from an AI. Okay, so let me ask you, because honestly, this has been fascinating. Do the Conservative Party listen to you? Is it a thing we have a direct relationship, or you just putting stuff out there and hope they listen?
Well, it depends what you mean by the Conservative Party.
Well, Conservative people across the political spectrum then.
Yeah, I would like to think so. I mean, it's I kind of broadcast with a megaphone rather than in sort of smoke-filled rooms. I know a reasonable tranche of Tory MPs. They would probably think I am a bit too dangerous and a bit too radical, and certainly some of the ideas I've put forward in this discussion.
I like them.
But yeah, I think we get a good hearing. But what I've targeted myself to is more the grassroots of the Conservative Party than the 121 surviving MPs. The 121 surviving MPs are the most important cohort. If you could have 121 conversations and change the mind of each of those, over a coffee or a pint, that would be fantastic. But I'm a great believer that politicians are more or less captured by their prevailing political environment rather than the masters of their own destiny. And therefore, if the Conservative Party or the wider Conservative movement starts to put these ideas on the table, and as I say, my key point is not so much about economics, it's about institutional and constitutional change. It's about changing the way that Britain is governed. And I would say in our first 10 months, we've had a lot of success there. Not because I've sat down face-to-face with Kemi Badenoch and had a discussion about it, but because we've been able to seed these sort of discussions into podcasts, on television stations, through our own email bulletin, at Conservative Party conference. And if you can change that climate of opinion, which is a very nebulous thing to measure, or in this particular case, I'm trying to give saliency to what's a slightly nebulous and abstract idea. I'm not campaigning to reduce income tax by 5%. I'm campaigning to completely reset the bureaucratic, constitutional, and institutional infrastructure of the United Kingdom. If you can get, those who are involved in politics and political discussions on the centre right, be you a Telegraph journalist, a GB News presenter, a local Conservative councillor, a Tory MP, a podcast presenter, to start to think, yeah, I think Popcorn and Littlewood are probably about right here, actually. This does seem important. Then as night follows day, the shift just happens automatically, like the tide coming in. It's very hard to claim credit for that necessarily because it looks like a sort of natural force. But certainly there is a correlation between Popcorn starting to put forward these arguments in February 2024 and where public debate is now, especially within the Conservative Party. Now, does that mean that Kemi Badenoch, just reads every word that I issue in an email bulletin and cuts and pastes it? Clearly, no. But does it mean that you can influence the tone, the tenor, and the boundaries of public debate and then notice the feed-through effects? There's definitely a correlation. And I think there's some causation as well. And what I've noticed, which you were alluding to at various points earlier in the show, is that there is a huge appetite out there for kind of radical thinking. And when I say out there, that appetite is greater in the grassroots than it is in the Palace of Westminster. If you are the Conservative backbench MP for Little Blogshire South, you might well be somewhat sympathetic to what I'm saying, but you're probably a bit of a caution first sort of person. If you're a rank and file member of the Conservative Party in Little Blogshire South, you're probably well up for what I'm saying. And if the congregation of the Conservative movement starts to believe what I'm preaching, then what the high priests of the Conservative movement say will absolutely surely follow. It's a bit like LBJs, get them by the balls and their hearts and minds will surely follow. I'm not sure I'd go quite that crudely on our strategy, but if the Conservative movement starts to buy into this, that we need a complete institutional overhaul and reset of Britain's constitution and the way government operates, which is a separate proposition to the government needs to be smaller. It's a question of how we decide what the size of government should be, presently decided by a quangocracy, more or less. I want it decided by our democratically elected parliament until we can get to my brilliant idea of tax referendum spreadsheets. If we can persuade Conservatives of that, a number of thousands, possibly tens of thousands of people, then that will become the established orthodoxy of the Conservative Party. Not taking anything for granted, long way to go. As we've already said, unfortunately, we're going to have 4 years of this ghastly socialist government, but that does at least buy enough time to rally the troops, make that clarion call, and to convert the Conservative Party to the light side of the force.
Well, listen, as a centre-right Conservative with a growing libertarian side to me, I'm well up for what you're saying. I can't agree more. I mean, we need a radical change. We need much smaller government. I would like much lower tax, not because I'm selfish and greedy, it's because I want to build more businesses. And so, look, I'm here for it. Loved it, man. Great to meet you, Mark.
Really great to talk to you.
Thank you to everyone listening. See you soon.